Hello again. This is a second video that I'm doing. This is week 1. And once again, welcome to the study of the book of Romans. And I just want to take a few moments to speak about a particular area of study as we move into the book of Romans. My desire is that we just become very, very familiar with what Paul says to us, what God says to us through the book of Romans. I'm asking you to read it through again and again. How do we read the book of Romans? This is maybe a surprising question for us to consider. You might say, well, you just read it verse by verse. You read it one step at a time. But there's something a little bit more to it than that. And so let me give you the two current views on the reading of the book of Romans. One would be what is called the traditional or the Reformation view of the book of Romans. The second is something called the New Perspectives on Paul. You may have heard of this. It is a rather in-depth, complicated discussion that's going on, and in some cases has become rather controversial, but it has to do with a way of viewing or reading the book of Romans. Let me give you just a quick introduction to that, if I may, and this will help you, I hope, insofar as your studies and the way you read the book of Romans. Last video, the first video, I mentioned St. Augustine and Martin Luther, and the traditional or the Reformation view of reading the book of Romans is largely influenced and shaped by the experience of these two great men. And it would be described as a crisis experience of learning or experiencing justification by faith alone. The crisis of coming out of condemnation into justification or the righteousness imputed to us by God. And this being viewed as a theme or the message of the book of Romans. That's the traditional or the Reformation view. And we would say amen to that. The New Perspectives on Paul is a different way of approaching the book of Romans. It does not discount totally justification by faith and the experience of Augustine and of Luther, but it says that Paul actually was shooting at something totally different. And the New Perspectives on Paul would deal with what might be called people groups, and that the theme or the thrust of the book of Romans was only secondarily justification, but rather was how do Gentiles fit into the people of God? How do Gentiles and Jews coexist as the people of God? And from this perspective, Romans 9 through 11, chapters 9 through 11, of course, would become central to the book of Romans. So let me give you a quick summary of these two different perspectives or these two different ways of reading the book of Romans. And this will grow in your understanding as you read and you study. I personally am deeply entrenched, if you will, in the traditional or the Reformation view of the book of Romans, but I increasingly appreciate the insights and the truths and the valuable truths that are brought to us from what would be called the New Perspectives on Paul. So here we have it. The traditional view of Romans would be centered primarily on justification by faith, and it would deal with the individual. It is the individual experience of the justification of God by faith, and so all of it zeroes in on the person. Now that, of course, is important. Now, by contrast, the New Perspectives on Paul would deal with the group. And so the crucial question for the traditional view is, how can a man be right with God? The crucial question for the New Perspectives on Paul would be, how can Gentiles be included in the people of God, and what does that do to the Jew, and what is the place of the Jew in the New Testament? That would be the crucial question. Now let's carry that further, and the second distinctive here would be that Paul, or the traditional view, Paul would be dealing with justification by faith as opposed to justification by works. And so the discussion or the argument with respect to the individual is, am I justified by faith, or do I have to keep the law? Works. That would be the traditional view of the book of Romans. Now, by the new perspectives on Paul, however, it would say that's not the question at all. The question would be, am I justified by faith, or as compared to the Old Testament view, which E.P. Sanders, who was something of the father of the new perspectives on Paul, in his book Paul and Palestinian Judaism, said this, that he said that the Jew in the time of Paul and of Jesus did not believe that they were justified by works. They believed that they were justified rather by something called covenantal nomism. Big word. Covenantal nomism. What is that? Well, they didn't believe they had to keep the law. They believed that they were saved by election. In other words, by being the seed of Abraham, by being the chosen people, and they didn't really have to do anything, that they were nominated by the covenant. Covenantal nomism made them the people of God. Now, if that's the case, then that was in direct conflict to anything that could be considered inclusion of Gentiles, because Gentiles aren't elected by God, Jews are, and the conflict that Paul was dealing with in Romans is the same one in Galatians chapter 1, which had to do with how do the Gentiles integrate into the people of God without keeping the law and become elect. New perspectives on Paul. Now that's almost cruel to introduce it that way to you, because I know I'll probably raise as many questions as I have answers, but as you read through the book of Romans, watch for these questions. How is a man made right before God? And also, what is the place and the relationship between Gentile and Jew? Those are the two different ways of reading the book of Romans. God bless you as you study the book of Romans. It's exciting to dive into the depths of biblical truth. God bless you as you study.